Farm. This was the site of the 11th Corps 2nd Division Field Hospital on July 1st, 1863, and then later the hospital for the entire 11th Corps. The house itself was built somewhere around 1820. Now, the original owners of the farm can be traced back to about 1797 and a man named John Dodd. However, the Spangler family moved here in 1848. It was George and his wife and their 4 children, Harriet, Sabrina, Daniel, and Benaiah. They moved here in 1848 and began a farm that had Irish potatoes, corn, wheat, oats, and a hayfield. A surgeon that worked in the barn, we'll take a look at that, was Dr. Brinton. And of course we're going to look at the summer kitchen, because the summer kitchen is where Brigadier General Louis Armistead was brought here after being mortally wounded on July 3rd, 1863. And it was in that summer kitchen that Brigadier General Armistead died in. So as we tour the George Spangler farm today, this is probably one of the most well-preserved Civil War hospitals in the entire country. It is also not accessible at any time. It is private property, private owned, and you have to have a ticket and take a shuttle to get here. So I've done this today so that we can bring you a video series on the George Spangler farm. So over the next few parts, and a few of them will be short, we will look at this amazing farm and field hospital that was here in July and August of 1863. This has been the George Spangler Farm, Part 1, Part 2. The field that's in front of us here contained a hospital graveyard where some 185 Union and 20 Confederate soldiers were buried. Some of the Spangler's own wood supplies were used to make coffins for these soldiers, and even a fence around the graveyard itself. One member of the 153rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry recalled looking for a fallen comrade at the hospital cemetery. This afternoon, I walked out to the hospital to see where he's buried. I found his grave in a field, marked by a board which was written, Henry A. Miller, Company B, 153rd Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteers. One grave contained the remains of George Nixon, the great-grandfather to the 37th President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon. He was a private in Company B of the 73rd Ohio, and he had been wounded multiple times on July 2nd, rescued by musician Richard Enderlin. Nixon was taken to this field hospital where he died on July 10th, 1863. Richard Enderlin earned a promotion to sergeant and later was awarded the Medal of Honor for his action. Today, George Nixon's remains rest in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Part 3, and we're standing near the Spangler Smokehouse. This smokehouse is over 160 years old, and though there have been some changes made to it, such as the roof up here, now smokehouses have been part of the outdoor barn complex since the 1700s. They had received their names because they were large enough for a person to enter, so thus being a house. These buildings were built in a simple manner and were mostly made of stone or brick in order to contain fire and ashes. Meat was hung in smokehouses as far away from the fire as possible, as it is the smoke, not the heat, that cures and preserves the meat for consumption. On Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Now, when the 11th Corps took over the farm to serve as a hospital, the Spangler family was forced to live in one of the 6 rooms in their home, most likely the room in the corner over here. One patient that was treated in the home was Frederick Stowe. He was a Union staff officer and the son of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Despite the extremely difficult conditions, the Spanglers chose to remain on their farm, sleeping in their single room until the hospital closed on August 11th, 1863. Though the Spangler family left a detailed list of the destruction of their property, they only noted $375 in damages to their house and barn for its use. And they put in claims, but it would only receive $60 in the end. This has been the George Spangler Farm, Part 4, Part 5 book. And also Secrets of the Battlefield. This is the George Spangler summer kitchen. It sits right here next to the George Spangler house and right over here next to the smokehouse, which we looked at. On July 3rd, 1863, Brigadier General Lewis Armistead was wounded in the action of Pickett's charge. Now, Pickett's charge actually took place just beyond the Spangler house to the west in that direction. He was brought here to the Spangler farm and taken here to the summer kitchen. His mortally wounded body was then brought through this very door right here, placed on a table right here under this window. Now, when he was brought here to the kitchen, the summer kitchen, neither of his wounds were considered mortal by the surgeons that attended him. Yet 2 days later, on July 5th, 1863, Brigadier General Armistead was dead. He was initially buried on the farm, wrapped in a blanket, and buried in the back of the barn that was filled with wounded men. His body was later reinterred at Old St. Paul's Cemetery in Baltimore. This is the window, most likely, and the floor that General Armistead died on July 5th, 1863. He probably had this as a view, his last hours. If you come here today, there are a few wayside markers that say what a summer kitchen was, or just talking about preserving history. This summer kitchen, however, is a very special place. During the American Civil War in the Victorian times, when houses were built out of stone, such as the Spangler house, it was far too hot to cook in them in the summer. So a separate summer kitchen was made. This is the summer kitchen for the Spangler farm, and this is the fireplace where the cooking was done. So, of course, Brigadier General Armistead was here in the summer kitchen in the summer, which was probably very hot, and probably laid here on a table near the fireplace of the summer kitchen. And, of course, this summer kitchen fireplace was also being used because this was a field hospital at this point. The barn that he was buried behind was probably the field sitting just to the barn today. On the other side of the barn is the bank, and we'll take a look at that in a later video. But this has been the summer kitchen here at the George Spangler Farm, the spot where General Armistead died on July 5th, 1863. George Spangler Farm, Part 5. We took a look at the summer kitchen. There's a post-war edition. And in 2013, while doing preservation work on the Spangler Farm summer kitchen, this well was discovered. After further investigation and interviews with previous caretakers of the property, it was revealed that the well was used for many years in the farming operations. The family removed the well pump and covered it over. It is possible that the Spangler family and the hospital patients may have used this very well here during the Battle of Gettysburg, which would have sat just here on the western side of the summer kitchen. This has been the George Spangler Farm, Part 6, and also Secrets of the Battlefield. We're taking a look here at the barn at the George Spangler Farm. And as you can see, I'm pretty much alone by myself out here. This barn was the field used as part of the field hospital here at the George Spangler Farm. And over its use in 37 days, over 1,900 soldiers were cared for on this property. Right here in this corner of the barn and the overhang is where most of the amputations took place. In fact, tarps were spread out here for shade. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the following days, as the heavy rains came, a lot of the wood tables and window frame doors and stuff were actually taken out into this high rise over here and placed in the field for soldiers to lie on, so that they'd be away from the torrential rain downpours in low-lying areas and not be washed away. Some of the other hospital sites, the tent hospitals, were over in this field here, just beyond this Virginia worm rail fence that we see. We're going to take a look inside of the barn here. And again, this is a barn where it is a field hospital, and it was a site where hundreds of wounded men were laying and operated on very rustic looking tables such as you see here. This is a very sacred place. It has a lot of history behind it. And again, soldiers spread all out across the fields here. In our next part, we're going to take a look at the other side of the barn, which is the bank leading up to the threshing floor. I also want to mention that after the Battle of Gettysburg, just on the western side of the barn over here is where all the artillery reserve was. Today there's a campground there called Artillery Reserve Campground. Over here by the Spangler house on the southern end was where all the ordnance reserve was. And then of course most of the horses and the animals were in this direction here along Rock Creek. So you had a lot of reserve positions. Powers Hill signal station was over here to the north. And again, this farm actually sat right in the hook end of the Union fish hook. It was concealed enough that where Confederates could really never tell what was going on around here, or the reserve artillery, ordnance, or horses that were around here. The signal stations would signal each other from Powers to Little Round Top to Culp's in secret decipher, and the Confederates were never able to break that decipher, realize that there was extra ordnance, extra artillery reserves, and extra animals in this area. This farm was situated right in the middle of the fish hook, which goes around Wolf's, Powers, and Culp's Hill, and then down on that direction toward the Round Tops. This has been the George Spangler Farm Barn, Part 7. Spangler Farm, Part 8. And I am on the bank right now of the George Spangler Barn. And directly in front of me, I'm looking directly to the west, which was the scene of Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863. This is the inside of the barn today, which is still under repair. But this is the barn on the George Spangler farm that was actually under fire. Now, the threshing floor that's in front of us was filled with wounded. W.R. Kiefer of the 153rd Pennsylvania Infantry noted the maimed were placed with heads next to the bays and in the middle partition of the threshing floor, leaving a passageway at the feet of the patients. 2 days later, on July 3rd, wounded soldiers laying here viewed the Confederate cannonade preceding Pickett's charge. Private Stephen Romig, 153rd Pennsylvania, recalled. He recalled, "There I had a fine view of the bursting shells coming in our direction. There were at one time 6 explosions of shells in one moment. The danger was becoming so great that every man was removed. The surgeon who had been in shortly before, looking at my wound, ran for his life." So again, as these men began to be cared for in this threshing floor, this barn, Pickett's charge happened right here in these fields in front of us, and the shells headed right in this direction, landing right in this general area here, right in front of the bank. There was one man killed during that action, and again, just to the right of the barn over here in this field was the tent hospital. So this entire field was being lit up with artillery fire from the overshooting action of the artillery during Pickett's charge. This has been the George Spangler Barn, Part 8. Barn Part 9, and we're still here at the barn here at the George Spangler farm, taking a look at one of the bank retaining walls. These were stones that were gathered in your farm field and used to make a wall where you would lead your bank. Now I do want to show you a little secret here. Right here, just after the Battle of Gettysburg, 10 or 15 years later, actually it was in the spring of 1875, two brothers, Samuel F. Fry and William H. Fry, who were painters, and also Hiram C. Lady, who was a carpenter's apprentice, began painting the Spangler's Pennsylvania bank barn. All three of these men signed their names below using red-toned paint finish that was on the rest of the barn. An additional signature on the top right is that of Benaiah Spangler, the youngest child of George and Elizabeth Spangler, who was born here in 1848. So again, two painters who painted the barn used and signed their names using the red tone paint, and that's kind of today how we know what color the Spangler barn was, that they repainted the Civil War structure. There is W.H. Fry and S.F. Fry. That's Samuel F. and William H. Fry. And then right here, H.C. Lady, Hiram C. Lady. And then, of course, one of the sons of George Spangler was Benaiah Spangler, and this is what B. Spangler is. And he has his signature here, and it sits here just on the side of the barn next to the bank. This has been the George Spangler Farm, Part 9. Spangler Farm, Part 10, the end. And I'm standing here today at the entrance to the George Spangler Farm, which isn't the original entrance. The original road actually was a little bit further to the left and went down in this area. There is an 1880s photograph of the George Spangler farm that I'm going to post that once sat right near where that road is. But I wanted to end our video series today actually at the beginning of the property. As you walk here, sitting on a boulder is the Army of the Potomac Medical Department Field Hospital marker. And I want to read it. It says the Division Field Hospital of the 11th Corps were established July 1st at the Spangler House, 230 yards west of this point. Now, I do want to stop there. It was the 11th Corps 2nd Division on July 1st. The 11th Corps hospital wasn't established here till a day later. At first, it was just the 2nd Division. Many of the wounded of this corps were cared for at the County Almhouse, Pennsylvania College, and in other division hospitals. They were consolidated into a Corps hospital about July 6th, as were all those Corps and Corps hospitals continued operation until the first week of August of 1863. These hospitals cared for 1,400 wounded. Medical Director, 11th Corps, Surgeon George Suckley, United States Volunteers, 1st Division Surgeon Louis G. Meyer, 25th Ohio Infantry, 2nd Division Surgeon D.G. Brinton, who we talked about on the bank barn, U.S. Volunteers 3rd Division Surgeon W.H. Tome, U.S. Volunteers Medical Officer in charge of the Corps Hospital Surgeon J.A. Armstrong, 75th Pennsylvania Infantry. As you can see by the bus that just passed us, the George Spangler Farm is off limits to the public. You have to be here on a special tour that you come here on a shuttle bus. The Gettysburg Foundation has a sign here saying authorized vehicle, no trespassing, no parking along the main road or the roadway, right above the Civil War Hospital George Spangler 11th Corps sign. And then to the right of that is the Armistead Hancock monument. It reads, "Friends and fellow officers in the United States Army prior to 1861, the fate of Civil War made them foes on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Confederate Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead and Major General Winfield S. Hancock were both wounded in Longstreet's assault, also known as Pickett's Charge, on July 3, 1863. Here at the Union Army 11th Corps Field Hospital, George Spangler Farm, Armistead died of his wounds on July 5th, 1863. I want to stop there for a moment. We did look at that spot in the summer kitchen there on a previous video. Northwest of this marker is the site, the Granite Schoolhouse, a Union Field Hospital where Hancock was initially treated for his wounds. Hancock survived the war and became a well-known military, political, and civic leader. He died on active military duty at Governor's Island, New York, February 9th, 1886, by the Armistead Marker Preservation Committee, February 18th, 2000. And as a note that isn't talked about, you can see between the names is the Masonic symbol. Both Brigadier General Lewis Addison Armistead and Winfield S. Hancock were both Master Masons and brothers of the Freemason fraternity, and they did deeply care about one another very much. They were both wounded here at Gettysburg. Armistead would die here in the summer kitchen of the George Spangler farm.
Worm fence. It's also known as a split rail fence. This is sitting along one of the original lines that George Spangler had one of his fences. It was used it was constructed with any material at hand. Right now we have just wooden rails, but if you travel along the main road towards Meade's headquarters, it's not uncommon that you will see stone for the foundation. And once you start building the rails or the stone, you'll make two holes in the ground where two posts, round posts, will crisscross and be stuck in those holes, and that is to stabilize it. And then on top of that, you'll start building more rails. So essentially that's how you build a Virginia worm fence. It was used for agricultural purposes. We think of keeping animals in rather than separating crops, but that is exactly what it did. It separated crops and kept the animals out rather than keeping them in.